coming to the city of Sarajevo, we simply added this red line on the already existing map to mark the Serbian territory around the Olympic city. It was that the Olympics were only 8 years before the siege. So in 1984 we hit the world headlines for becoming the first city in the non-aligned world to host Olympic Games. But only 8 years later we again hit the headlines of the newspapers all over the world by becoming the capital under the siege at the very end of the 20th century and also in the very heart of Europe. I don't mean to, let's say, pretend that we are better than somebody else because we are in Europe. I specify this because after the World War II, Europe said never again. Mm-hmm. And not that the siege of Sarajevo occurred during the war, but the genocide occurred in Europe after Europe said never again. So that is why I'm specifying this. Then, take a look at the map. You see these areas over here, and over here we don't see it, but it's actually the same, pretty much the same, the hills and the mountains. This is the mountain Trebević, and this is the cable car you took to yesterday. And then your hotel is right here, very near this big mosque that we were at yesterday. It's Hotel President. Then we took this road to get here. This is where we are right now, outside of the city of Sarajevo. Also, along that road, we passed one peculiar part of the city of Sarajevo, which was called the Sniper Alley. There's a lot of people who come mostly from the United States asking me about the book, which is called The Cellist of Sarajevo. Cellist of Sarajevo was a person who was playing his cello here in the city during the siege and so on and so on. But this Sniper Alley is very well described and written about in this book. This is a wonderful book to read. I personally, The Cellist of Sarajevo, I personally recommend it.
Cellist.
And then, this is the Sniper Alley because of course this Grbavica neighborhood that I pointed out from the bus. Then, following that road, we'll come to Ilija, which is this town where this funny roundabout was. And then we drove through this neighborhood, which is called Butmir, and this is where we are. This blue stripe is the airport stripe and the airport runway, which we actually see from here. So the tunnel went from here, which is where we are right now, to there, which is here on the map. Okay? Also, there is this yellow line that leads all the way to the road up on the mountain Igman, which is this trench that I told you was about 16 miles long, and it went that way. We see this just a little bit of the slopes of Mountain Igman over here because right now it's covered with the fog. But the Igman mountain is that way. Also, it's important to mention that the Adriatic coast, were in particular Split and Dubrovnik, were the harbors where the help from United States, Germany, Italy, and Spain was coming for the city of Sarajevo, for the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, they took the road that you took to get here day before yesterday from Dubrovnik to deliver the weapons to the city of Sarajevo. However, the major part of that road that leads to the city of Sarajevo was occupied by the Serbs. So they had to find a way over here, over the mountains, to build another one to be able to deliver these weapons into the city of Sarajevo. This supply line existed a few months before the tunnel was built. But before the tunnel was built, they used runway to walk over it, and 800 people were killed trying to do that because nobody was allowed to use the runway, but at the same time Serbs were allowed to shoot anyone that wasn't a part of the UN. So that is why 800 people were killed. And that is why the civil engineer, Nedžad Branković, came up with an idea to build the tunnel underneath it. Technically, it wasn't the UN territory, but underneath it. So the UN couldn't actually, yeah, they tried to block the construction and so on, but never mind. We are a forgiving people, not very resentful. So we forgave them this, but never forgot, of course. But so far we have forgiven. But the truth is, the tunnel was constructed nevertheless, and was, as you see, the only way in and out from entirely besieged Sarajevo. And now, my dear friends, do you understand how it all looks like? Of course we do. So now it's time for your questions. Yes, madam.
Did most of the supplies, the UN, United States, etc., did most of them reach the people of Sarajevo?
Well, no. The truth is that, unfortunately, in the wars, nothing is black or white. There are no good or bad guys in the wars. There are, well, a little bit better and a little bit worse, but basically it's one big gray zone. When it comes to this, there were cases where people, our people, could get their hands on the humanitarian aid intended for the Sarajevans, managed to take it and sell it on the black market, and in the meanwhile get enormously rich. Bless you. So that is unfortunately true. Unfortunate truth is also that the tunnel didn't only play the humanitarian role, but also was a lovely platform for all sorts of smuggling. So, which of course, many times they had the priority, or even over the wounded people that were taken through the tunnel. Yes, ma'am.
Why did the UN object?
Well, that's a good question, because there is no explanation. We cannot demand UN explanation from them. But I can only tell you my presumption, which is that since Bosnia and Herzegovina has had the embargo on the import of the weapons set by the international community that should last until 1993, international community decided that they want to prevent the conflict on the Balkans by actually forbidding Croatia and Bosnia to have the weapons. So UN, of course, was there to protect the embargo. And they knew if we're building the tunnel, then we will build it to bring the weapons in. And if they would allow us to bring the weapons in that case, it would mean that they are breaking, we are breaking the embargo, and they are actually looking at it and agreeing with it. So that's actually my romantic version that I want to believe. But what was the truth, I'm not sure. On the other side, why they stopped objecting is another debatable thing. I personally believe again, and some of the soldiers that were fighting in the army over here, and they were also involved with the digging of the tunnel, have confirmed that, well, the bribery works where nothing else does. So that the UN soldiers and officers were also bribed, and to just look the other side. This lady had a question before. Yes, ma'am.
So, what, I'm sorry I don't know this, but what was actually the job of the United Nations forces? What was their job when the United Nations said, okay, you're going to Sarajevo? What was their job?
Well, Bosnia was the first Bosnian conflict was the first conflict in the world where United Nations formed so-called UN Pro-4, or United Nations Professional Forces. They were supposed to have a military reaction. However, the part of United Nations are Russians, who put the veto on the intervention, military intervention. So basically, their role was to deliver, well, was more of a humanitarian role, which was bringing humanitarian aid, medical supplies, to organize
and
the
let the two
convoys.
sides fight it out themselves.
Exactly. So, and not taking anybody's side.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
But the truth is on the other side as well. For example, easiest way for me to explain it. I see 4 bullies, which are much stronger than you are, and are bullying you. And I have a power to stop them, but I decide to be neutral. So, what do you think? Whose side I'm taking in that case? So I have a power to stop a bully that is actually molesting you, harassing you, and so on. But I'm not, because I am neutral. So whose side I'm taking. This is, of course, completely off the record. But that's actually, it's simply a logical thing. So the same thing is, over here we have 148 tanks surrounding the city of Sarajevo. We had 35,000 people living in Srebrenica, which was a protected enclave by the United Nations, where they have disarmed Bosnian army and supposed to provide protection. But once the Serbs started invading Srebrenica, they simply retreated. So basically, that is the answer to your question. That was their role. Neutral, but at the same time actually on the Serbian side, because the Serbians had all the weapons, invading their own country, killing their own people, and you have a power to stop them, but you're neutral.
But after the massacre, that's when they took action with the troops.
No. The UN never actually got involved with the war. Never. However, NATO did. NATO did. NATO did. It's a little bit, let's say, the NATO is the instrument of the United Nations. But the United Nations actually, it's a little bit separate. NATO is actually the military alliance of North Atlantic. But the Russia is not part of NATO. However, it is part of United Nations. So they are two separate institutions. Yes, exactly. Bosnia, for example, is part of United Nations, but it's not part of NATO yet. Okay? And we, of course, stream to be one. Yes, ma'am.
After the breakup of the Soviet Union, as I understand it, at that period in time, Yugoslavia also, some of the countries were asking for independence, such as Croatia, which we've already been there and know that. But it appears to me that was also true in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where the Serbs, which were also part of the population, is that correct?
Yes.
Part of the country wanted to have independence and the other part didn't.
Precisely.
So we would call that a civil war.
Yes, precisely. But it's a bit tricky. It's a bit tricky because, for example, one of the reasons why international community, for example, put this embargo on the import of the weapons to Bosnia and Croatia was because the Serbs presented these wars where they were attacking Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia and Herzegovina as if they want to preserve the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. But it was breaking the constitution of Yugoslavia from 1974. Every republic of former Yugoslavia had every right to separate if the majority of population decides to. So, what happens next? That in Bosnia and Herzegovina we have Bosniaks, Serbs and Croats. Bosniaks and Croats were for the independence, which was a vast majority of population, and you have Serbs which didn't want to have the independence because of course they wanted to stay in Serbia. So Serbia takes advantage of them, gives them the weapons of the Yugoslav People's Army, our army, which was also our army, and they actually were the ones who took all the blame. But the entire brain behind it was actually Serbia. So the same thing is with the Crimea right now in Ukraine. So of course you have Ukrainians who want to be part of European Union in Crimea, some of them don't want to be. And the Russia gets involved by actually supporting those who don't want to be part of European Union, and you have a war. But the brain behind it and the support to those ones that oppose is actually much more powerful than they are. Bosnian Serbs would never be able to do all these things if they didn't have all the help from Serbia, actually.
Well, now they gave them the weapons.
Yes.
But were there also any military forces from Serbia also in the...
Yes, but they're called paramilitaries. They're called paramilitaries, which were mostly the military forces led by the criminals or mafia, you know, who supposedly it was organized individually by these people, so they're called paramilitaries. So Serbia basically escaped the responsibility for the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But it's fully responsible for it. Yes, madam.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
You lived through this, obviously. I'm assuming the shelling was random. They just shelled wherever they felt like shelling.
Precisely, yes.
So you didn't know from day to day if your house was going to go, your neighborhood,
Exactly.
correct?
Absolutely correct. That is the worst part of everything. On one side, regardless of how much, for example, the bombing by the air can be devastating, at least you